This podcast is made possible by you, the supporters of WPLN and WNXP, Nashville Public Radio.
This is the Nashvillager Podcast. It's March 13th, 2025. On this day in 1862, President Lincoln signed a law barring federal officers from returning escaped slaves to their owners. And believe it or not, that has had a lasting impact on Nashville. I'm Nina Cardona, and this is your daily digest of what's happening around Middle Tennessee with historical context from Nashville Public Radio, WPLN News. Why do some parts of a city become associated with different racial or ethnic groups? A lot of times, it's mostly an economic thing. If an immigrant group relocates because of hardship in their home country, they probably come to their new home without many resources, so they settle in an area where they can live cheaply. And over time, that area becomes theirs. But the story's a little different when it comes to Nashville's Black neighborhoods. Now, as long as there's been a place called Nashville on the map, there have been Black residents. And even early on, at least a handful of those people were free. But before the Civil War, most were enslaved. Where they lived was a function of what was most convenient for the people who controlled their lives. And the overall ethos at play in this part of the South was to try to limit Black folks' time alone together. All this to say, there weren't really Black neighborhoods yet. And then, less than a month after Nashville became Union-controlled territory, the federal government adopted this law that essentially made places in Union hands safe territory for people wanting to flee their enslavement. Safe from being returned, anyway. There had, of course, been ways to escape before, and people did. But traveling the Underground Railroad could take a long time. It carried plenty of risk. It was full of unknown factors, and you needed a knowledgeable guide. It wasn't a realistic or available option for everyone. Having a safe zone in a southern city, though, that was something entirely different. Very soon after word of the new law made its way to this area, large numbers of people showed up seeking freedom through proximity to the Union Army. Now, the law didn't task anyone with helping these escapees, so officers' reaction was mixed and more than a little confused. But it quickly became clear that the Army wasn't going to be able to keep moving south without figuring out some kind of strategy, because everywhere they went, Black folks eager for any shred of freedom they could get showed up and made it clear that they were going to stick close. So a strategy emerged of encouraging people to settle into what were called contraband camps. The very first one was established in West Tennessee, but Nashville soon became home to several. If you saw the massive tent cities the UN set up for refugees from the Syrian civil war, that's basically the modern version of what was happening here. The late historian Bobby Lovett wrote about what life was like in those camps. And if you're interested in really digging in deep, his books on Nashville's Black history are excellent and are available through the library. Suffice it to say, it was rough. But right now, I'm going to fast forward to the time after the Civil War and emancipation. Once everyone was free, they didn't have to stay in a designated spot to have legal protections. Some people got out and didn't look back. But as many problems as there were with contraband camps, and there were many, they did offer community at a scale that otherwise just hadn't been available to most of these folks. That was incredibly valuable. Someone taking those first steps out of slavery, out of the slavery system, didn't have much in terms of tangible possessions, but they had their skills, they had their freedom, and they had each other. So, of course, many didn't want to leave that connection and that closeness. The spaces that had been contraband camps evolved into Nashville's Black neighborhoods. Edge Hill, Jefferson Street, Edge Field. People started replacing the tents with houses. They built churches. They started businesses. And of course, there was an incredible amount of complexity to it all. While there was a degree of choice and safety and strength in sticking together in distinct neighborhoods, it also didn't take too long for the people empowered to decide Black people should only be in those places. And eventually, when banks drew red lines on maps to designate where they would and wouldn't fund mortgages, those were the neighborhoods left on the outs. Same for infrastructure improvements and resources for public schooling. Things have changed over time. Gentrification has pushed many of those historic communities farther out from the city's center, and in some cases scattered folks to the wind. North Nashville is the primary exception, is still a major stronghold for Black community on one of the spots where it was first able to form and thrive in this city. In just a few minutes, looking back on the Tennessee Valley Authority's massive coal ash spill. That's coming up after the newscast.
The justice system is complicated. I'm Paige Flager, and as WPLN's criminal justice reporter, I'm constantly asking, is the system working? And who is it working for?
The system is broken. I think it's more punitive than anything.
And this is not about justice anymore. This is about vengeance.
We're trying to get justice from a justice system that failed us.
How policies impact real people. Hear their stories here on WPLN News.
Here's the latest from WPLN News. Tennessee has not reported any cases of measles yet, but about a dozen other states are seeing outbreaks. WPLN health reporter Catherine Sweeney tells us that most people who got vaccinated against the virus are still protected, even if it was decades ago.
Every year, public health experts tell people to re-up their flu and COVID vaccines. But for the measles...
Well, if you've had a standard 2-dose vaccination series with measles vaccine, you have a 98% chance of being fully protected throughout your life. That's about as good as it gets.
That's Dr. William Schaffner, an infectious disease expert at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Some people didn't get the standard 2 doses. Those born between 1957 and 1958 likely got a vaccine with a different recipe, one that's not quite as good. And those born from 1968 to 1989 might have gotten just 1 dose.
So that provides more than 90% protection. But if you'd like to get up to 98%, you can get that second dose.
State data says about 75% of Tennessee kids aged 4 to 6 had the MMR vaccine in 2024. In Williamson County, that rate is lower than half. For ideal herd immunity, vaccination coverage would be 92% or higher. Catherine Sweeney, WPLN News.
Students with disabilities are being unlawfully removed from Tennessee classrooms. These were the recent findings by the Office of Research and Education Accountability, known better as OREA. It's a team of public policy researchers studying K-12 and higher education in the state. The findings noted that many of the students removed largely go undocumented by state and district officials, making it difficult to determine how often this occurs. An informal removal might happen if a parent is asked to pick up a child earlier than scheduled because of disruptive behavior. However, this removal may not comply with state and federal regulations that protect students with disabilities from discriminatory disciplinary actions, plus ensuring the students the right to receive an education. The team findings recommended that schools examine space and staffing needs to support students with disabilities, as well as come up with behavioral techniques. According to the Tennessean, hundreds of school principals listed a shortage of special education staff as the largest contributing factor to the student removals. Tennessee's General Assembly is trying to eliminate race-based policies when it comes to selecting members of state boards. A bill that passed the House on Monday eliminates a rule requiring the governor to appoint at least one person of color to each board. The bill's sponsor is Republican Jason Zachary. He says this will bring state law in line with a 2023 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that banned using race-based affirmative action in college admissions. Zachary also says some state boards have had trouble filling vacancies. Democrat Harold Love opposed the bill. He says minority representation is important on state boards such as the Maternal Mortality Review Committee. Black women, says Love, are more than twice as likely as white women to die in childbirth. The bill passed the House with all Republicans in favor and all Democrats opposed. It now heads to the state Senate. Ministry programs like Nashville-based Higher Love bring professional musicians into prisons to bring hope, healing, and messages of self-worth to the incarcerated. But in 1950s Nashville, inmates Johnny Bragg and his group, the Prisonaires, were allowed outside the prison walls to write, record, and perform. Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum's Michael Gray tells our Daily Show This Is Nashville that this release program brought Bragg emotional healing.
I know that he looked at music as his lifeline, and that he talked about how for one thing, he could just escape the boredom of prison life and the ugliness and all that. But he also said that music gave him direction and confidence and motivation and, and just a real purpose.
A new album of Bragg's unreleased songs, live recordings, and demos is available now from the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum. You can learn more about Johnny Bragg, the Prisoneers, and Just Walkin' in the Rain, the hit song they recorded while in prison, at the This Is Nashville podcast feed. While construction on the new Tennessee Titans Stadium chugs along, the demolition plans for the existing stadium have now been decided. The Titans have selected the Indiana-based company Renascent Incorporated to lead the teardown. The Nashville Business Journal reports that Renascent has experience on various stadium projects, as well as selective demolitions at the Nashville Airport and Ascension St. Thomas. The current timeline shows Renascent beginning the design and working to get the permits in the summer of 2026, with the actual demolition to take place in 2027. And a hole left behind to be filled the following year. Meanwhile, the new stadium is expected to be finished in February 2027. Tonight, a total lunar eclipse will grace skies above Middle Tennessee. You don't need any special equipment to see it. Just step outside under a clear sky and look up. WPLN news editor Miriam Kramer explains why the moon will look red.
During a total lunar eclipse, the moon passes into the deep shadow of the Earth. But that doesn't mean it just appears black. The moon takes on a red color because light from the sun is scattered through Earth's atmosphere. It filters out blue light, but red still gets through. How deep the red is can be influenced by things like clouds and dust, even volcanic ash. So each total lunar eclipse looks a little different. And yeah, some people call it a blood moon. That's a little much for me, but call it whatever you want. Just go out and give it a look tonight.
The total phase of the eclipse for us will begin at 1:26 a.m. local time, and it will last for over an hour. You'll find more news anytime at WPLN.org. In 2008, the Tennessee Valley Authority became the face of the largest industrial disaster in U.S. history. A 60-foot mountain of coal ash broke from a retention pond, and the toxic sludge spread across the town of Kingston, Tennessee. Afterwards, hundreds of workers tasked with removing the mess got sick. A group of them sued the corporation that oversaw the cleanup for TVA. Jared Sullivan tells the story of their 10-year legal battle in a new book, Valley So Low. WPLN's Caroline Eggers sat down with him.
How do corporations approach pollution lawsuits?
So the playbook for these sort of big environmental mass tort cases, as they call them, is to drag it out for as long as possible. Why? Because as you're litigating it, the plaintiffs, the workers, get sicker and sicker and sicker. And as they get sicker, they get more desperate and desperate for money to cover their mounting medical bills. That's the playbook. So this case ended up dragging on for 10 years, and it got to the point where these workers are so sick and they were so desperate for money to cover their medical bills that they basically had to capitulate.
What did you see with the workers? What type of health conditions?
Their symptoms range from, heart failure, lung issues, and also many, many cancer diagnoses. So more than 50 of the workers have now died. I met a worker named Ansel Clark who responded to the disaster the morning it happened, and I got to know him, and I was at a Kroger here in Nashville. I got a phone call, that he had collapsed on his floor because he had a rare cancer and he had congestive heart failure, and he unfortunately passed away.
What were some of the most surprising things that you learned?
Okay, it's actually based here in Nashville. I went back in the Tennessean archives to see, okay, who was reporting on coal ash? What I found was in 1964, the Tennessean had an outdoors columnist. He was not a hard news journalist. He wrote about hunting and fishing. Well, he got tips from fishermen on Old Hickory Lake that there was this sandy, sooty substance on the lake, and it was killing fish tied to their stringers. So Bob Steeper from the Tennessean, he gets on a little boat and he goes out and investigate, shoe leather journalism. And he finds that there's 2 pipes coming from the Gallatin steam plant that are expelling coal ash into Old Hickory Lake. And, he writes a column about it, calling TV out saying, "You claim you're an environmental steward. Yeah, I went out and I saw your pipes First of all, I mean, that shows the importance of good local journalism. I mean, classic case of guy heard something, got a tip, went out and investigated, and he found it. The next thing, I got memos from the National Archive. Around the same period in 1964, TVA's director of health sends a memo to TVA's head guy at the time saying coal ash being pumped from TVA's plant in Paradise, Kentucky is landing on employees' cars and is peeling away the paint. This is 1964. And yet, jump ahead to 2008 when this coal ash disaster happens outside of Knoxville, TVA has the nerve to put its PR people in front of TV cameras and basically say, oh, this coal ash stuff, don't worry about it. Yeah, it's like we made a big mess, sorry, but it's no big deal. Don't sweat it. TVA has had a pretty good idea for many, many years what it's dealing with, and it has, in my view, deceived the public.
So your book mentions hot stuff a couple of times. Do you want to tell what that is and why it's important in the context of the coal ash spill?
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. started rushing to build an atomic bomb, and they decided to build in Oak Ridge because TVA could supply the power. Well, as they were building the bomb, they created a lot of waste, and they dumped that waste straight into rivers. And this is not a secret. You can spend 5 minutes Googling this, and much of that radioactive pollution made its way downstream to Kingston. Well, in 2008, TVA had this 6-story tall, 84-acre mound of coal ash that collapsed right into the Emory River, and of course stirred up the river bottom. I mean, coal ash is bad enough by itself. It's full of arsenic and silica and beryllium, the stuff you don't want to inhale, right? But now it's almost certainly had uranium mixed in with it too. Then it dried out and it got in the air. And the workers, they tell stories of being out on these boats in the middle of the night where they're sucking up coal ash from the bottom of the Emory River, and their Geiger counters go off because they've hit hot stuff.
So having reported on TVA for years through this book, how has that affected your perception of the direction TVA is heading now?
In my research, I read somewhere that if TVA was anywhere else in this country, if it was in in California or New York, the public outrage of TVA would be so great that it wouldn't be able to get away with like half the stuff it gets away with. But I feel like Tennesseans is a little of a nuts because I think a lot of times we give TVA a pass. That is not the response we should have. We should be demanding TVA do great, bold, ambitious things because it has done great, bold, ambitious things in the past.
That was Jared Sullivan, author of Valley So Low, in conversation with WPLN's Caroline Eggers. We do this roundup of Nashville news every weekday. Please consider subscribing on your favorite podcasting app. And thanks so much to all of you who have left 5 stars, a thumbs up, or a review in your app of choice. A little bit of love really does tell the algorithms that more people should hear about us. And of course, everything at WPLN News is listener supported. You can make a donation at WPLN.org. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. Let's make this day a good one, and we'll catch back up tomorrow.